Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club's District Attorney Forum. I'm your moderator for today, Sean Farrow. Today's format will be as follows. We're going to cover 4 topics: mass incarceration, violent crimes, accountability, and office values. Each candidate will have 3 minutes per response. To begin, we will have each candidate give a 3-minute opening, and at the end, each candidate will have the opportunity to give a 2-minute closing. The order for each question has been selected at random, and the order will vary for each question. Please keep your answer within the allotted time so as to allow everyone an opportunity to speak. We ask that each candidate refrain from posting in the chat until it is their turn, so as not to take away from any of the speakers. The first topic will be mass incarceration, and the order for mass incarceration will be as follows, which will be the same order for the opening. Ms. Crotty, you will go first, followed by Ms. Weinstein, and Ms. Florence, and we will turn to Ms. Lang, Mr. Bragg, Ms. Orleans, and Mr. Court. Ms. Crotty, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes for your opening.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate being able to talk to everyone. My name is Liz Crotty, and I want to be your next Manhattan DA. First, I'm going to take a little bit of my time to talk to you guys as a New Yorker. We are in the midst of coronavirus and a big shutdown that's going on 11 months. We need, as every individual who is a concerned citizen getting on this to listen today, have to implore our leaders to get the vaccine out safely and quickly. We did better 100 years ago. We should be doing better than we are now. I think that public safety is the cornerstone of getting this vaccine out and ready to all of us, because the sooner we get it, the sooner we are safer and the sooner we go back to our lives. I'm here today because I care about the office. I talk a lot about my experience and being on both sides of the courtroom. I was a Manhattan DA for 6 years, and I was and I have been, still am today, a defense attorney for the past 12, going on 13 years. I think that my past 20 years career has been spent being on both sides of the courtroom and learning the different perspectives from both. When you are a prosecutor, you are in the position of telling people what you think, what the facts are, and what should happen with the case. When you are a defense attorney, you listen. I have to listen to my clients. I have to listen to where they're from. I have to listen to what their life is like. And then I have to listen to what the prosecutor is saying. And we need to work on, and then you have to work on getting a fair result for your client. And that's what I want to bring to the district attorney's office. That 20 years experience of listening to both sides of the courtroom and listening to what we can do to make this fairer. That's what I think my perspective is and an experience that I bring to this race. And that's what I want to do. I talk a lot about the different practices. I want to clean up the practices of the office. I think they can have better practices. They can be more efficient. They can really use their investigative tools for the good. This can start with orders of protection and using them correctly, not in every case, but in cases where they really matter. Sometimes there's no investigation as to where people live, how it affects where they live, their jobs, going to school. I think we should go and try misdemeanor cases within 6 months. We should not allow the use of certificates of readiness to unnecessarily prolong cases. Justice delayed is justice denied. These are some of the things. The priorities for this office that I have are, first of all, listening to victims. Victims' voices matter. We have to listen to victims. We have to tell them what's going on in the case. Sometimes we have to educate them about the criminal justice system. We also have to make sure that victims are heard, and when we are in the position to help them, we should do so. We also need to crack down on white-collar crime. New York City is the epicenter of the universe, and especially the epicenter of the financial universe. All dollars that flow throughout the world flow through New York City and the Fed. It gives us jurisdiction. We need to look at what is going on. We cannot have peace in the streets if we don't have it in the suites. And that's why white-collar crime really needs to be looked at and investigated. Third, we need to have public safety in every neighborhood. Public safety in every neighborhood. This does not mean arresting everyone in every neighborhood. This means public safety. Kids have to be able to go to school. stores have to be able to stay open, and people have to go on their jobs, ride the subway, and be safe. I have the experience to bring that to New York, and that is why I'm here today. And I look forward to all of your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Ms. Weinstein, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Sean, Lois, and Barry. I'm delighted to be here today and to introduce myself to you. And I always introduce myself as an immigrant. I came to this country as a young girl when there was a revolution in my homeland in Iran and chaos and violence all around, and arrived here on Christmas Eve of 1979 to start a new life, to seek asylum, and ultimately a decade later we got amnesty. And I start there, even though obviously things have changed a lot for me over the last 4 decades, because that remains my framework through which I see everything. I have committed myself in my career to fighting for fairness and safety for others, as my parents fought to bring me to a place where I could experience fairness and safety. And it also means, like many immigrants, when I see a barrier to access or to opportunity, my instinct is to want to tear it down and to level the playing field. I grew up and wound up working across American legal institutions. It is a joy for me now to be able to say, as of last week, that I worked closely for 3 attorneys general of the United States. My first job out of law school was with Judge Merrick Garland, who will become the Attorney General soon enough, I hope. After working for Sandra Day O'Connor, I went on to work for Eric Holder in the Obama administration as one of his counsel, supporting him in his management of the legion of federal prosecutors around the country. And then I went to work for Loretta Lynch before she became the Attorney General. And I was a prosecutor in her office for 6 years, bringing every manner of cases. And finally, my last stop was in the Brooklyn DA's office, where I was part of the management and leadership team of an office comparable to the one that we are all seeking today, helping District Attorney Gonzalez to bring to life his vision of criminal justice reform. I managed large components of the office, including where we took all our legal positions. I built new bureaus of the office and supervised them, including a post-conviction justice bureau. And I learned in the accumulation of all of that experience what cases to bring, what cases not to bring, and how law enforcement ought to stand for people and with people rather than against them. And that forms my vision for Manhattan, and I'm looking really forward to talking about it with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Florence, if you're there, you would be next. Give it a moment. If not, we will move on. She will be joining us in a moment. Ms. Lang, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much, West Harlem Progressive Democrats. I'm Lucy Lang, and I want to start by thanking you for all the work and advocacy you did around the national election and around Georgia. It's that kind of engagement that's so inspiring to see in our communities across the city. I'm a neighbor on 122nd Street, and as a national criminal justice reform leader and a former assistant district attorney, I know that the role of the district attorney encompasses far more than prosecution alone. It requires collaboration with communities, prevention, and rehabilitation. And the next district attorney must take a 360-degree view of the system and everyone it touches. In 2015, I prosecuted a case that some of you may remember on Upper Broadway, in which 2 masked gunmen came out from behind a car on a Super Bowl night and opened fire, shooting 5 people and killing 1, the father of a 3-year-old. Over the course of a long investigation, I became close to the mother of the man who'd been killed, and the jury returned a guilty verdict after trial. I called the mother the morning after the guilty verdict and asked her how she felt, and she said, when I woke up this morning, I had slept all night for the first time since my son was killed on Upper Broadway that night. But when I woke up, all I could think about were the moms of those 2 boys, referring to the men who just killed her son. This reminded me of the blinders that the criminal justice system puts on all of us. And it was one of the reasons that I created a first of its kind college and prison class to bring assistant district attorneys inside New York State prisons, to study alongside incarcerated New Yorkers and develop ideas for change. It's also why I've been a leading voice advocating for ending the dehumanizing practice of stripping people of their right to vote while they're incarcerated. Imagine if all of us had to advocate for our candidacy inside of New York State prisons, how different the office of the district attorney would look. It's my work with communities that has led to my endorsement by families who lost loved ones to police violence, for our work together creating protocols that have been adopted across the country. It's my work around trauma and supporting victims that's led to my endorsement by survivors and silence breakers of Harvey Weinstein. And it is my work on reforms in District Attorney's Office in collaboration with communities that led to my endorsement just this week by nationwide progressive prosecutors. I know how to transform the system because I have worked to do that from inside and outside. And I'm running to realize the full potential of what the Office of the District Attorney can do. Prioritize healing and prevention, uphold racial and gender equity, and promote the dignity of every New Yorker. I so look forward to this conversation today, and I would be honored to receive your endorsement.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg.
Good afternoon, Harlem neighbors. It is an honor to address this club. I'm a lifelong resident of Harlem, and I know the great work that you've done both locally and nationally. When I was growing up in Harlem, one of my first interactions with the police was going to the corner store for groceries on 139th Street for my dad. NYPD officers came upon me, put a gun inches from my face, falsely accused me of being a drug dealer. That was the first of many stops growing up in Harlem, 3 of them at gunpoint. I also had a gun pointed at me 3 times by people who were not police officers, and that was equally as terrifying. These early experiences are why I went to law school and why for the past 20 plus years, I've been in the courtroom fighting for both civil rights and public safety. I left Harlem, went to Harvard for college and law school, and came right back to Harlem, 151st Street and Broadway, and got right to work. Started out as a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, became a public prosecutor focused on public corruption, and then became the Chief Deputy Attorney General of New York State, overseeing an office of 1,200. Along the way, doing both civil rights and public safety work. So I meant one day prosecuting the owner of a $30 million business who laundered millions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel that did great violence in our communities. And on other days, prosecuting an FBI agent who intimidated Black and brown witnesses and lied. Or representing the Garner family, as I am currently doing, seeking transparency and justice 6+ years after Mr. Garner was killed. I look forward to our conversation today. There are a number of candidates. I should be here today for 3 easy reasons. The first is this is a job about doing cases, and I've done the full spectrum of them. Start with the Trump matter that's on the DA's docket. I led the AG's work holding Trump accountable for the Trump Foundation, and we sued Trump over 100 times for DACA ban, family separation, and all of his evils. I also have done the full spectrum of work from heinous sex offenses, gun trafficking, but also what's important is the cases I haven't done. I didn't grow up in the DA's office. I didn't do those misdemeanor trials that have oppressed our people. The only misdemeanor trial I've done is prosecuting men who are blocking the Planned Parenthood facility and not letting women and staff in to get treatment. The second reason is this is a job that is very, very about management. I've overseen an office of 1,200. I know how to reorient and focus the office on the trauma of sex advisors and get real police accountability. And the third is all of this work is personal for me. I know about reinvestment in our communities from my mom, who was an educator, and my dad, who ran homeless shelters. I know about reentry from my brother-in-law, who lived with me after he was incarcerated. And I know about stops myself personally. I'd ask that you join with our neighbors, Robert Jackson, Congressman Marengo, and C. Virginia Fields, and so many others in supporting me. Thank you, and I hope to earn your support.
Thank you. Ms. Orleans.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Eliza Orleans, and I'm the only public defender running for Manhattan District Attorney. And today I'll make the case why, for being the only public defender, makes me the best candidate to be your next Manhattan District Attorney. Most of the candidates you're hearing from today are former prosecutors with more than 6 decades of prosecutorial experience between them, all of whom have prosecuted misdemeanor cases. And they're proud of their prosecutorial experience. They think it makes them more qualified than a public defender like me to be your next Manhattan District Attorney, but I disagree. And I would implore everyone listening to think about what it really means to have prosecutorial experience in the United States, to have played an active role in a system this unjust and cruel, and to have held a position of power in an organization while it rampantly violated human rights and human dignity. What prosecutors do every day to the people like the people I represent is cruel, inhumane, and plainly wrong. And like so many other things, it's taken our country far too long to acknowledge that. Why should an arsonist be trusted to put out the fire? Can we really trust someone to change a system in which they were complicit? Can we entrust this process that is so urgently needed and so long overdue to the people, prosecutors, who've been most directly responsible for the injustice? It's public defenders, not prosecutors, who have the experience we need. The demonstrated commitment to honestly acknowledging the problems and fighting to fix them. I've spent my entire career going up against Cy Vance's office in court. I've represented thousands of people charged with crimes and handled as many as 180 clients at the same time. And for every human being I've represented, I've had to manage countless moving parts, from making strategic decisions and interviewing witnesses to leading teams of investigators, social workers, paralegals, experts, all without ever losing sight of the unique stories and circumstances and human beings at the heart of each case. When prosecutors make decisions that have devastating impacts on people's lives, they blame the system. They say they were just doing their jobs. But it's public defenders who pick up the pieces, who advocate for restorative justice and rehabilitation, and work every day to break the cycle and change the system. And that is precisely the experience we need. We need a next Manhattan DA who will fight, who brings a sense of urgency, who understands what's at stake. Simply having a vision for changing the office, even if it's progressive, isn't enough. The next DA must have the will and commitment to make these changes from day one. We have no time to waste. We have to remember, when Cy Vance ran, he also made promises that sounded good to progressives at the time, and he has not kept those promises. We need someone who understands the implications of all of these policies and with a commitment to transforming the system, ready to make bold systemic change. I am that person. I will do that. And I hope you will join me in the fight. I would be honored to receive your endorsement. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Court.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Lois, and to the West Harlem Democrats. Thank you for bringing us here this afternoon to talk about the issues critical to Manhattan. My name is Dan Court. I'm a state legislator and practicing litigator, both civil and criminal defense attorney, for the better part of 21 years. I grew up on 193rd Street and St. Nicholas Avenue in Washington Heights, the son of a teacher and social worker. Moved to the East Side when I was 17, only because of an affordable housing program called Mitchell-Ama. Went to college upstate of Binghamton, then came home and went to law school at St. John's. Took me about 15 years to pay back my student loans, but proud of that fact. I ran for the city council in 2005 after being awarded as one of the city's top pro bono attorneys for representing those on the precipice of eviction through the Legal Aid Society. The Democratic Party told me in 2005 it wasn't my turn. I ran anyways, and they showed me. I lost by 3,000 votes, but I didn't give up. I opened up a free legal clinic with eviction intervention services and continue to represent people who couldn't afford a lawyer in civil court. In 2011, elected to the state legislature, and in my 10 years in Albany, have been a leader on criminal legal reform, criminal justice reform. I've been the forefront of every significant piece of legislation passed and fought against in Albany. And I'm running for district attorney this year, not to be another prosecutor, not to do the small things, but to break down and really rebuild an office that is not functioning, that is not working for Manhattanites. And I will do that in three very specific ways. First, a complete revamping of the sex crimes unit within the office. Epstein, Weinstein, only the most known failures of the sex crimes unit within the office. And I have a 9-point plan on exactly how I would go about reforming that department within the office. Second, end the use of surveillance-based technology, the use of these conspiracy laws, which have been the subject of how Cy Vance took 103 Black and brown kids and young men out of Central and West Harlem during his tenure in office. I've spoken out against it. I've been in the community working at night shift complexes so people would foil themselves, so they themselves could know if they were on this list. And I will not use this practice as district attorney. And last, the thing I'm most synonymous with in my 10 years in Albany, ending all sorts of practices that punish poverty with no public safety benefit. That is the epicenter. That is why I'm running, to reduce the footprint of the office. And I look forward over the next hour or so of discussing in detail exactly how I will go about doing that.
Thank you very much. We turn to our first topic, mass incarceration. We will start with the same order that we had the openings for. I believe Ms. Florence might be joining us. We will continue. And if Ms. Florence does join us, she will have an opportunity to give an opening as well. So we turn first to Ms. Karate. Ms. Karate, your website says that too many people violate the law and end up in our criminal justice system because of poverty. Many of these people are committing low-level offenses just to get by. We know that most of those swept up in the system are Black and brown people, mainly Black and brown men. As an assistant district attorney under Cy Vance, you were responsible for putting some of those Black and brown men battling poverty in jail. Why should New Yorkers believe that you are the right person to reduce mass incarceration when at one point you contributed to it as a DA? And what would you do differently than Cy Vance? You have 3 minutes.
Well, first of all, I was never an assistant DA under Cy Vance. I was an assistant DA from 2000, 2006, and I worked only for Mr. Morgenthau. But I'll give you a clear example. I tried a misdemeanor marijuana case. The guy had several open cases and had 2 or 3 past violation convictions. We had a trial, and then at the end of the trial, he was found guilty. And at the end of the trial, the judge said, "I'll hear you on jail." And I said, "Oh, judge, there's no jail here." I was like, it was holding the defendant accountable. I was like, just because he tried the case does not mean he needs to go to jail. And we didn't give jail. We gave some community service after trial, because the point wasn't to put someone in jail. The point was to hold somebody accountable for their actions. If you go through my record as an ADA, I have a very stellar record as to giving probation and giving non-jail dispositions at a time when people didn't really give them. I was in front of Judge Berkman, and when you're a DA, you have part judges. And when you're there, you have to go in front of this judge on a weekly basis. I remember one time she yelled at me for 15 minutes about why I always give probation on my cases. I was like, because I think people need a chance to do better. I stand on my record as an ADA, and it's a very fair one. I never thought jail was the answer when I was an ADA, and I don't think jail is the answer when I'm a defense attorney as well. I work very hard to keep my clients out of jail, and I work very hard as a defense attorney to give my clients an opportunity to do better. And so I've worked on an individual basis from the start of my career to the end of my career to really work for fairness. And I work on that every day. So I've never been a fan of jail, and I stand very proudly on my record as an ADA. So that is one thing. I think what we really need to talk about is that incarceration in New York City has dropped by 50% in the last 10 years. And I think what the problem is with the incarceration rates of New York City right now and Manhattan is even with them dropping, it's still disproportionately Black and brown individuals who are going to jail. I think that that's where community reinvestment really comes in, and going into the communities and saying, what can we do better? So I think it's a 2-pronged approach. And if they do come into the criminal justice system, we need to work on keeping people out of jail, and we need to work on cutting recidivism. But that does not mean not holding people accountable. And so that's how I feel about mass incarceration. And I look forward to your next question.
Thank you very much. Ms. Weinstein, you've gone on record to say that cash bail should be ended, but you believe that judges should be allowed to use dangerousness to determine whether to detain someone before trial, a stance opposed by many criminal justice advocates. Dangerousness is a very broad and vague term which many judges could abuse. As we've seen in the news in the past year and change, society views Black and brown men as it relates to danger or threats wholly different than that of white people. How will allowing the judges to use dangerousness to determine whether someone should be detained reduce the incarcerated population, especially when factoring in the very human notion of prejudice, race, and biases?
Sean, thank you so much for that important question. And let me first start by saying that I have been a longtime advocate of bail reform. I think that the situation that prompted bail reform was totally intolerable. Across the state, so many people, and particularly people of color and people living in low-income communities, were being detained while still presumed innocent, before their trial, often longer for the amount of time that they were facing if they would even be convicted, in horrifying conditions and with absolutely no justification for public safety. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that in the Brooklyn DA's office, before there was any legislative change, we demonstrated bail reform. We reduced our pretrial population by 80% without any outside force, through our own volition, through a change in management, and without any cost to public safety. I think that when we step back and look around the country for models for how to do bail reform, I think that we can do better than what we've done in New York. And so, across the country, usually there are two reasons why you might ask and a judge might agree that someone should be detained before trial, either because they are a flight risk or because they are a risk to others. There's a risk that they might hurt others, right? And sometimes that is shorthand for dangerousness before their trial starts. Think about the school shooter, right? And I think that the better course is to talk openly about both of those things in court, and for a defendant to be able to say, I'm not a public safety risk, or I'm not a flight risk. So if it were up to me, that would be the system that we have. That's how the federal system functions. That's how the New Jersey system functions. And on the other side of that, I would have eliminated cash bail completely, because I don't think that there should be any connection between a person's freedom and how much money they have. Now, I'm glad you asked about the disparities, because I do agree with you that any sort of judgment around danger, and frankly, even around flight risk, places where we are able to use our discretion, have been opportunities for racism to express, and we have to be vigilant about that. So one strategy is, if you are going to talk about public safety risk, to use tools and outside tools to do risk assessments that try to account for some of this. And then, of course, to monitor disparities and to change course when you see that they are being produced in the system that you're working in. I think there is no holy grail here, Sean. I think whatever system we have seen that we have to hold ourselves very much to account for the disparities that the criminal justice system and frankly other government systems have produced. And that is a part of the work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Florence, are you here ready to join us?
I am. Thank you. I'm sorry about the confusion.
No problem. I'm going to give you an opportunity to give a 3-minute opening. And then actually the next question is yours for mass incarceration. So you have 3 minutes for your opening.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Diana Florence, and I'm running for Manhattan DA to fight for the people that have been harmed and overlooked by the criminal justice system. It's what I've done my entire career. As leader of the first of its kind construction fraud task force, I created a community-based model of prosecution that was replicated nationwide, managing investigators, lawyers, and analysts to target crimes of power instead of targeting crimes of poverty. That meant that in my career, I have taken on corporations that stole from workers and killed people on the job, and targeted those that abused their domestic partners. And I've gone after big real estate that ripped off tenants and harassed them out of their homes. That's exactly what your DA is supposed to do. But for too long, the current Manhattan DA has done the opposite, over-criminalizing people of color while giving a pass to the powerful like Weinstein, Epstein, and Trump, only reversing course when publicly exposed. Imagine for a moment what the world would have looked like if the current DA had done his job and used his power to do justice for all New Yorkers, no matter where they lived or what they look like. My vision for the Manhattan DA means we don't have to choose. It's not different to go after corruption and also curb gun violence. We can do both because they are connected. When we target corruption, the money that we recover from those who cheat every single one of us can fund our essential services that have been defunded, like education, job training, affordable housing, and healthcare. These are the systems that give our lives meaning and hope. And we all know that people with hope for the future, they don't turn to gun violence. I am so proud to be the candidate of working people And I am the only candidate in the race that has labor union support. Over a dozen labor unions are backing me, hundreds of thousands of workers. That means laborers, bus drivers, sanitation workers, carpenters, and everyday working people who know that there is no one in this race who has my record consistently over decades of standing up to power. And that as DA, my priority will always be prosecuting crimes of power. And I won't do this alone. I will do this alongside the community that elects me and that I serve. I will never forget that I am a public servant, accountable to the electorate. I will make sure, together alongside the community, that every New Yorker feels safe at home, safe at work, and safe on the street. Thank you.
Thank you. Staying with mass incarceration, Ms. Florence, this question is for you. You have had the stance that if elected DA, you would cease prosecuting low-level offenses and instead turn your focus to crimes of power. While focusing on crimes of power may be a good focal point, you have been silent as to how your office will view cases that are not low-level offenses and not crimes of power. In these instances where the charges are not that of a low-level offense, the accused still faces state prison time. And if they have a prior record, they can face a mandatory minimum. Oftentimes in these situations, defense attorneys will seek to get their clients into programs since their clients are often battling drug addiction, poverty, mental health issues, and trauma. Prosecutors under Cy Vance have often opposed getting clients into programs. As a former DA, what is your plan to reduce mass incarceration as it relates to these types of cases? You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. You know, when it comes to homelessness, poverty, we need to start by saying those are social ills and they are not crimes. And for too long, we relied on the criminal justice system to solve society's ills, and no longer. And under my DA administration, look at each individually. And it is not about blanket policies. We need to be sure that when we look at a case, whether it is violent or nonviolent, that our goal is that this case is the very last case that this person has in the criminal justice system. So that means looking at each person and figuring out what the right result is. That does mean sometimes there will be incarceration, but more than incarceration, we need to be using that as the last resort. We need to be looking at alternatives and why this person got to this point. If there is addiction or homelessness or poverty, then we can use our resources at the DA's office to help solve those problems. That means when we go after corruption, as I just mentioned, we can sentence the corporations to fund programs. I've worked with programs like Getting Out, Staying Out, and they have an incredible model that starts with when a person is charged and stays with them all the way through their release from custody. And so that's the way we need to be looking at these cases first and foremost. Second, we need to be thinking about the alternative courts, mental health court, addiction courts, and not having default barriers that if someone has something in their history that they are no longer eligible. That is the way I've conducted myself my entire career. I've always looked individually at cases, and that's how we will attack mass incarceration, by looking at each case individually, not relying on incarceration as the only solution, and in fact, using it as the last solution.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lang. Ms. Lang, you have hailed yourself as a national criminal reform advocate. You are a former assistant district attorney under Cy Vance, whose office has put countless Black and brown people in jail. One reform that did occur under Cy Vance was raise the age. For those not familiar with raise the age ended New York's practice of automatically charging all 16 and 17-year-olds as adults for any offense. One of the main issues with raise the age is the racial disparity. Nearly all youth arrested in New York City are Black, about 61%, Latinx, 32%, and the vast majority were male, 85%. Why should New Yorkers believe that you, as a former prosecutor who contributed to this, is the right person to be DA and will reduce mass incarceration as it pertains to our youth?
Sean, I am committed to making ending mass incarceration a stated value of the district attorney's office and counting on community to hold me accountable for that. To that end, I intend to publish case level data that is cross-referenceable with demographic data so that the public can ensure that I'm staying true to that. But more importantly, with respect to children, we should treat kids like kids, and I will not be prosecuting children as adults under my administration. I want to take it one step further, though, because this club knows that there are 2.2 million Americans incarcerated right now, and that's unconscionable. And the district attorneys can be part of solving that. But in New York State, we have 80,000 children who have an incarcerated parent. And we know that those are amongst our most at-risk young people. We need to create a set of strategies that are focused on generational change to support young people who are at risk of negative health outcomes, of incarceration themselves, and all manner of other terrible outcomes by merit of their parents being incarcerated. So our efforts to end mass incarceration need to take a long-term view. The way that I intend to do this is by declining to prosecute low-level cases, diverting cases out of the system that don't belong in the criminal justice system, that belong in public health systems, in the Department of Public Health and Mental Hygiene, the Department of Homeless Services, and others, and supporting pathways into those systems. And then I intend to build out the array of options available for violent crime. And I'm happy to direct people to a piece I published with a Guantanamo defense attorney last year about how what we really need to do if we are serious about ending mass incarceration is stop relying on mandatory minimums, on 3 strikes laws, and all manner of other draconian policies that have resulted in mass incarceration as it relates to violent crime, because simply diverting low-level cases is not going to solve this problem. We need to build out restorative justice. We need to scale what's known as alternatives to incarceration, which I think of as responsive sentencing. And we need to radically reform the way that we view the response to all kinds of crime, not just low-level matters. And the reason we need to do that is because kids are being torn apart from their parents, and that is causing a generational trauma that is cycling over and over, and particularly victimizing vulnerable Black and Brown communities.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg, the NYPD database labels over 18,000 people in New York City as active gang members. More than 400 of those are under 18. Nearly 99% of those people whose names are in the database are people of color. The criteria to enter someone into the database is overly vague and broad, and young people who have not been arrested or accused of any criminal activity have been added into the gang database. And the NYPD does not notify people when it classifies them as gang members. There's no mechanism for challenging this. You recently received an endorsement from former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, who conducted the famous raid on the Bronx where 120 people were arrested. Only 2 of the 120 chose to fight their charges at trial, while the rest, the 115, entered plea agreements. The crimes they pled guilty to were significantly less severe than the crimes the prosecutors had originally accused them of committing. My question for you is, what is your stance on the gang database? And do you think its use by the NYPD will continue if you're elected?
Let me be clear, Sean. I will not use that database. It is a tool of racism. Unlike all the other candidates here, mass incarceration is about me. It's about my family. It's about my loved ones. I was over-policed. My kids are the ones who are at jeopardy of being stopped. I've dedicated my entire career from fighting stop and frisk, from working on reentry to fighting mass incarceration. So my view on the NYPD database is rooted in my experience as a kid. I not only falsely accused of being a drug dealer, but being a gang member. So I know garbage in, garbage out. That's what the NYPD database is. I will not make any use of it. Now, you mentioned Preet. I am honored to have his support. I want to talk briefly about the work I did in his office. I didn't work on gang cases. I worked on cases involving public corruption, prosecuted an FBI agent for lying and intimidating Black and brown witnesses, prosecuted the head of the state Senate majority leader for trying to bribe his way onto the ballot. I did cases that upheld the integrity of our system. But when it comes to mass incarceration, my work has been to dismantle it, investigating companies that have reflexively discriminated against people returning home from incarceration, like my brother-in-law. Standing up side by side with the Garner family to fight against police killings. So my record is extremely clear on this, both in terms of fighting mass incarceration and the work I did in the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I'm proud of, fighting against and dismantling systems of power that have worked against our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Orleans, you went on Hot 97 radio station and discussed many issues, including mass incarceration. While in the air, you said current lock them up and throw away the key approach is basically political posturing by career prosecutors. Your strategy to reduce violent crime and reduce incarceration is to find alternatives to incarceration, driven by evidence-based solutions. You did concede that jail is necessary in certain cases, which you say you and your staff would review carefully. What are some of those evidence-based solutions you can enact today if you were DA, and in what circumstances is jail necessary?
Thanks, John, for such thoughtful questions. I think, it goes without saying, but we incarcerate far too many people here in Manhattan. Cy Vance, out of all the New York City DAs, sends more people to jail and prison than any other DA in New York City. And we must significantly decrease the number of people incarcerated in our jails and prisons. And furthermore, obviously, close Rikers and build no new jails. But the focus has to be on not just ending cash bail and putting in place other systems that are equally, if not more, racist by using a dangerousness standard, but truly trying to abolish pretrial detention and using it only in the most extremely rare circumstances, and using the legislative stated purpose, which is the risk of someone's failure to appear, without taking into account other factors that are inherently racist. So in terms of evidence-based solutions and alternatives to incarceration, that is how we will decrease crime across the city. We will keep New Yorkers safe. And that's because, number one, the things that work are investing in people and investing in communities. And the data's there. We know that when we do things to address the underlying issues people are facing, that we prevent them from ever returning back through our criminal legal system. And that is how we keep our cities safe. That is how we make sure that people are not ripped apart from their families. I represented a young woman a handful of years ago who was charged as a teenager, prior to raise the age, with gun possession. And the Manhattan District Attorney's Office refused to offer her an alternative to incarceration, refused to come off anything except for jail. And thankfully, a judge, took a chance on Jessica and said that Jessica could participate in an alternative to incarceration, in which she excelled. I mean, just beyond. She came in with her update letters every time, just saying how well she was doing. She was attending more hours than mandated. She was becoming a mentor to other kids. And a couple of years after that, after she successfully completed the program and received youthful offender status, meaning she did not have a criminal record, I got a call from her saying that she was graduating from high school, and I proudly attended and spoke at her high school graduation. And, here we are years later, she's engaged. Her fiance and her just went through IVF, and her fiance is pregnant. And she has an amazing job and recently passed her MTA bus driver test, and she'll be a local Transit Workers Local 100 member. And so, the idea that mass incarceration is the thing that is going to keep us safe is absolutely outrageous. And I know that from personal experience from the thousands of people I've represented as a public defender. And Jessica's story is just one of many. And all of that informs my views and understanding that there is such a tiny percentage of people committing the largest number of violent crimes. And we can use data to figure out how to address those, but we don't need to use jail as our only solution.
Thank you. Mr. Court, you have discussed publicly a list of 18 things you won't prosecute as your way of reducing the incarceration rates. Even without prosecuting those 18 things, incarceration rates are likely to remain high, as prosecutors often find themselves prosecuting those with prior criminal records. Additionally, those with prior criminal records are subjected to mandatory minimums unless the prosecutor decides to give a lesser charge. Prosecutors, in my experience, have been very reluctant to do that. Lastly, those with criminal records tend to have mental health issues and poverty issues, among many others. If elected, aside from the 18 things you won't prosecute, many of which are very minor offenses, what policies will you enact to reduce incarceration rates, especially as it relates to those with prior criminal records?
It's a two-step, well, it's a great question, but it's a two-step approach. One is legislative reform to undo the harm of the last quarter century in our courtroom. And the second is reducing the footprint of the DA's office itself within the courtroom, both with declining to prosecute, and secondly, with a reduction of charges to ensure a reduction of sentencing. Let me give you an example. The two most important things we can do in the legislature on decarceration is parole reform and expungement. And let me take up expungement because it's significant to me, because thousands of people across Manhattan and throughout New York City have criminal records based upon low-level convictions, whether it's marijuana and B misdemeanors. So in Albany, what I fought for and what we need to do is create a universal right of expungement. That will be the most significant thing we do to reduce the number of people throughout New York City and beyond with criminal records that leads as a predicate to further arrest and prosecution. And that's something I've been focused on for the last half decade in various work and taking up this session in Albany. That's the first half. The second half to your question, Sean, is reducing the footprint in the courtroom itself. Yes, the easy part is the decline to prosecute list. The harder part is how to use the law to reduce punishment from those who will be prosecuted. I'll give you one example. Drug charges. Certain drug charges have 3-year sentences, 8-year sentences, depending on the amount of the narcotics taken, based upon the ounce or the weight. I want to reduce that. I'm not saying we're not going to prosecute those who engage, unfortunately, in drug dealing, but they don't need to serve 8 years. They don't need to serve 3 years. These are not the drug kingpins. We can stop and end the war on drugs across New York City, and by that, we can reduce those who are incarcerated. It's not a decline to prosecute list solely. It's going beyond that to reduce the footprint in the courtroom. And the reason why as well is process is punishment, Sean. This is significant. Just the fact of coming back over and over again is a form of punishment. That's what I'll try and reduce as district attorney.
Thank you very much. Turning now to our next topic, accountability. We're going to start off with Mr. Bragg, followed by Mr. Court. Mr. Bragg, if elected, you plan to create an independent unit dedicated solely to investigating police misconduct. Misconduct also includes police officers who lie on the witness stand. Rarely do courts find cops incredible as a matter of law, which means rarely do courts put on the record that the police officer's testimony is untruthful. What will be your office philosophy as it relates to holding police officers accountable, especially on the witness stand, if they have not been found incredible as a matter of law, but nonetheless lie or tailor their testimony?
Thanks, Sean. Independence is the key. The DA must be independent from the police. Since I was a 15-year-old boy staring at a gun from an NYPD officer on 139th Street, I've dedicated everything I've done since then to police accountability. Starting out 20 plus years ago, suing the state police for excessive force, and now, as I mentioned, representing the Garner family suing the NYPD. And in between, suing law enforcement who lied, and prosecuting and taking a trial and convicting an FBI agent for doing just that. So this is a top priority for me, and it starts with independence. I'm going to do my own evaluation. I'm not going to rely upon a judge to make what you and I would call an adverse credibility finding. Basically, the officer lied. I'm not going to rely on the NYPD to make that assessment. I'm going to do it myself. I've done this throughout my career. I've looked officers in the eyes and said, you cannot testify in my case because I don't trust you. And that distrust arises from my own personal experience. It gives me a radar for police misconduct that others don't have. And I built on, in a professional sense, that radar to hold police accountable. When I would do that as DA, we would have a list of officers that we would not use. I mean, let's talk about things. Let's go beyond just an actual lie. Let's talk about any officers who were down there in DC during the insurrection. They're not testifying in any case I do. So I'm going to make independent assessments of who we're going to call as witnesses based upon whether or not I think they are fit to testify in a way that is significant and would obviously have a deprivation on someone's liberty. So that is my decision as district attorney. I take it more seriously than anything because I've lived it. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you. Mr. Court, one of your campaign promises you made is to publicly disclose the names of police officers you do not find trustworthy. Publicly disclosing such names could result in police slowdowns or blue flus, which makes the streets less safe. Also, the DA's office relies on the police to investigate their cases. How will your office go about determining which police officers are untrustworthy while avoiding any type of slowdowns that can make the streets less safe for New Yorkers?
Thank you, Sean. It's an important question. The answer is because my job as district attorney is not about striking a balance. It's about accountability. Accountability of police officers or anyone else engaged in crime throughout Manhattan. It's about a singular standard of justice throughout Manhattan, something we haven't had over the last 11 years. And that means not treating NYPD officers as a protected class, because they're not. There is no protection in the state constitution or state law that provides them that. So we'll treat them equally. And the same as anyone else who engages in excessive force or lie or violence on the street, or who is incapable of telling the truth. This is something I've been actively involved in Albany in my legislative work for multiple years. I've pushed Cy Vance to publicly disclose his list of officers he deems untrustworthy. But that's just step one, because simply not using them in a courtroom, in a court proceeding, is not enough, because then they go back to the precinct house and then they'll continue their ways as officers walking the beat. And that's why in Albany, for the better part of 10 years, it's not just about a police accountability. It's about taking away the police secrecy laws. It's about working with then Public Advocate Tish James on forcing dashboard cam footage and body cam footage to be disclosed to the public. Because if you, the taxpayer, are paying for those tools to know what's going on in the public, you should be aware of them as well. My views on accountability as district attorney stem from 10 years in Albany on police accountability, and I have the record to demonstrate that what I say I will do in the campaign, I will actually do as district attorney.
Thank you. Ms. Orleans, as a former public defender, you are familiar with the plethora of complaints filed against certain police officers, with many of the complaints going unsubstantiated. When a complaint is unsubstantiated, the officer usually faces zero consequences. How will your office seek to hold police officers accountable when the complaints are unsubstantiated, but the officers are consistently having complaints filed against them?
Sean, thanks for these great questions. I do have to point out, though, that as a public defender, I know and you know that during the slowdowns, in fact, crime went down. So I think that, I just want to point out that I think that holding police accountable obviously is a huge priority for me as your next Manhattan District Attorney, but it's what I've done throughout my career as a public defender. And what we know is that when the police were engaging in these slowdowns, crime actually decreased. And why is that? Because over-policing is not what keeps us safe. And, to answer your question, though, I really do think that it's incredibly important to hold the police accountable. And that's why I will establish a dedicated unit for prosecuting police misconduct. And it's not just the brutalization and assaults that we see on the streets, but it's also the perjury in the courtroom, which, we know occurs regularly, which we've seen police officers walk into the court and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do. And then lie, whether it be to a grand jury, whether it be at a hearing, or whether it be to a trial jury. And we know that. Whether it's based on video evidence or just the impossibility, because I've gone to scenes where crimes are alleged to have occurred, and I've stood where an officer stated that he was under oath, and then I've looked over to where he says he saw something occur, and I know that it was impossible for that person to have seen that. And so this, even if the police department and the CCRB are not going to hold police officers accountable, you can be sure that as your next Manhattan District Attorney, I will, because that kind of misconduct will not be tolerated. We are not going to have police officers who are committing that, who are putting people behind bars and in cages because of these lies, because of all of this, and allow them to continue to do that without repercussions. The current Manhattan District Attorney's Office has really been complicit in continuing misconduct perpetrated by the NYPD. And, prosecutors have really used their power to shield and protect police officers instead of holding them accountable. And that will not be tolerated under my reign. My unit will advocate and prosecute police misconduct, and also keep track of all of these police officers who do have repeated complaints against them, because an unsubstantiated complaint doesn't mean that the misconduct isn't occurring. And that's something that I know from my over a decade as a public defender, and that I will bring with me to my position as the next Manhattan District Attorney. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Florence, you had to resign from the Manhattan DA's office after being accused by defense attorneys of failing to turn over exculpatory evidence in a case. Exculpatory evidence is evidence that would tend to show the person's lack of guilt. If elected, you will be in charge of an entire office whose responsibility includes turning over evidence to defendants and their lawyers to ensure a fair proceeding. Why should New Yorkers vote for you when you resigned amid a scandal in which you withheld key evidence?
Thank you so much for this question, because I always appreciate being able to tackle this head on. And there has been a lot of misunderstanding and misreporting of what happened. I did not resign as a result of a lack of transparency in turning over exculpatory materials. In fact, I resigned because I was about to do a major case against landlords who stole millions of dollars from tenants, and that work was taken away. And at the very same time, I was working on a 13 defendant, multi-million document case represented by connected attorneys in the office, connected to the very top of that administration. And my work was unpopular. To be clear, I worked on behalf of tenants, immigrants, and workers. And it was against big companies and powerful individuals. And so I was getting success, a lot of success, and my resources were cut at sometimes overnight. So in the case that ended up, the mistake was made, that I made a mistake because I didn't realize that all the documents hadn't been turned over. There were many exculpatory statements that were turned over, so I want to be clear about that. But there was a mistake. One of them was not. And when I found out about it, I immediately corrected it and owned it. That's leadership. I didn't blame someone else. I didn't say that it was someone else's fault. I took the heat, and that's what you want to do. We need to make sure that resources are appropriately directed towards crimes of power. And that's not what happened under Cy Vance. My particular case was an example of that. And we need to make sure that that never happens, because that doesn't serve justice for anyone. So when I am DA, I will make sure resources are appropriately directed. That means flipping the way the DA's office is organized. Right now, the majority of lawyers, as you know, are directed towards crimes of poverty, not crimes of power. And we need to make sure that the lawyers and the resources, support services, electronic services are directed towards these cases so that mistakes like the one that I made don't happen. We don't have to accept them.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lang, this next question is for you. For those not familiar with the criminal justice system, when a police officer makes an arrest, their actions are often the subject of a hearing. Should the court find during the hearing that the officer's actions on the day in question were unlawful, the court will suppress the evidence, or in other words, prevent the evidence from being used at trial. In these circumstances, the police officers will have testified that their actions were lawful by telling one version of events. But suppression will imply that the court thinks that the officer lied. Usually the courts do not put this on the record, and the only remedy provided to the defense is suppression. As a former prosecutor, do you think suppression alone is a proper remedy for police violations of the law? Why or why not?
Suppression is one critical response to officers' decision-making, but it is far from the only possible response. And for far too long, that has been, cases have moved forward without an appropriate analysis of whether or not, if something is suppressed, the officer's conduct should be looked at more holistically, and there should be a possibility of some additional response. So as district attorney, I am committed to making police misconduct an absolute cornerstone of the office. And that's based on the time that I spent working alongside families who lost loved ones to police violence, because we know that it is that kind of misconduct and brushing things under the rug that results in a culture that has led to the crisis levels of racial injustice that we see in the country. So I'm committed to a district attorney's office that will be part of fostering a new approach to policing. That means supporting and working with community-based initiatives, advocating for the decriminalization of crime so that police aren't asked to respond to every little thing that happens in the street. I will take a proactive role in improving NYPD training and policy to be aligned with the office's moral and ethical standards and the philosophy that the public's calling for. And I will closely monitor police actions, ensure that there are public health responses, and build on the office's mechanism for identifying officers, including in the kind of instances that you described, Sean. So to be able to hold police accountable when they create the harm they're meant to stop, I will thoroughly and independently investigate instances of misconduct, including after suppression. Following every serious investigation of police misconduct where we would decline to charge, we will assess the possibility of publishing a detailed report, and we will communicate clear policies to the NYPD about when the DA's office won't bring charges based on the involvement of officers with a history of misconduct or findings of adverse credibility, or even patterns of suppression of the kind you're describing. We'll also establish clear policies that require DAs to review body-worn camera footage before bringing charges in the kinds of cases in which we frequently see police misconduct, like resisting arrest.
Thank you very much. Ms. Weinstein, you have said that you are committed to investigating thoroughly claims of police misconduct, following the evidence wherever it leads, and holding law enforcement officers accountable when they offend. That you would build on your work in the Brooklyn DA's office to make sure police officers' credibility is regularly assessed and fairly disclosed. However, police officers aren't the only type of witnesses. Civilian witnesses also have been known to lie on the stand, as well as some DAs failing to turn over discovery or otherwise evidence in a timely fashion in accordance with the discovery laws, thus negatively impacting defendants. How will you regularly assess police credibility and ensure that it is fairly disclosed? Additionally, what will your policies be for witnesses who lie on the stand or DAs who provide discovery late to defense attorneys?
Thank you for the question, Sean. And I appreciate so much that you have connected civilian witnesses who lie under oath and police witnesses who lie under oath. And just by the nature of your question, made clear that our obligation is to treat them the same. And we have an ethical obligation never to suborn perjury or in any way rely on testimony that we think might be false. So, when it comes to police, let me just say that my team in Brooklyn was the first in the state, as far as I'm aware, to create an internal process for deciding who are police officers who we, in our own judgment, because we have our own responsibility to do this work, not just relying on other adjudicatory bodies, who we found not credible and thus would never use. And we made a list and we published the names, even as the primary source of another affiant's testimony. So a police officer on that list could not turn to his partner and say, this is what I saw, and then that would be the basis of a search warrant. And that's a model that I would continue, and the spirit of the transparency of that model is something that I would continue. You asked a bigger question, I think, about how to manage this kind of practice, and I'd like to say a couple of things about that, again, really drawing on my experience. First of all, I think it's really important for line assistants to have some place to go to work out some of their ethical questions and questions of practice before they make a mistake and before it's too late. And so I served as the Chief Ethics and Professional Responsibility Officer in Brooklyn, and I performed this function. So I had people come to me and say, look, I'm feeling pressure to put on such and such witness. I'm not sure what to do. Here are the things that are concerning to me. Can I proceed here ethically? What is the right thing to do? And so, I think we really have to create a culture where that kind of questioning, training, learning works. The other is we have to hold everyone to a reckoning and account. And I would love for the listeners of this call to look at the report 426 Years, which we published, the Conviction Review Unit, which I supervised, with the Innocence Project in WilmerHale. It took us a year to go through our first 25 exonerations in Brooklyn. And what we said is this is an indictment of our profession. And we detailed the places where the police had transgressed, where prosecutors had failed in their obligations, where defense counsel, where judges, where other actors in the system had contributing to letting down the men. These were all men, and 24 out of 25 of them were men of color who had wound up together serving 426 years in prison wrongfully. And that has to be our starting point, is to call out mistakes, to own them, and then to proceed to fix them and to retrain to prevent them from happening again.
Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Crotty, you told the New York Daily News last month and New York County Politics this month that if elected, you said that you will urge the NYPD to reinstate the plainclothes anti-crime unit that was disbanded in 2020. This is the same unit with one of its plainclothes cops killed Eric Garner with a chokehold. Police Commissioner Shea said in response to disbanding the unit, "This is a policy shift coming from me personally, and the men and women in the police department were doing what I asked. They have done an exceptional job, but again, I think it's time to move forward and change how we police this city." How will reinstating this controversial anti-crime unit lead to accountability?
Thanks, Sean, for that question. First, I'm going to note in your first question, you asked me about my record as a former prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 6 years. There's 4 other prosecutors who are also running for DA, 2 of which were former federal prosecutors, and you did not ask them about their incarceration rates while they were prosecutors. And I have been a defense attorney much longer, for twice the time I was as a prosecutor. So I just want to note that. I think in terms of accountability, my answer, which I stand by, was in response to these shootings going up 200% since they disbanded anti-crime. So what I was saying is that we have a shooting problem. The gun problem is a huge problem. Now, I was not suggesting that anti-crime go back on the streets and with not any constitutional checks and to violate people's civil rights. That was not what I was suggesting. I was being responsive as a New Yorker, as a person who sees crime going up in compromised communities and in Black and brown communities, and saying, how can we get the shootings to stop right now, right here? So I think anti-crime, which was a specialized unit within NYPD who went out and their job was to get guns off the street. I do not say that at the sacrifice of one person's civil rights. And that's why there's suppression laws, and that's why there's accountability that we just talked about. But I'm just saying that there is a big problem. Crime is going up and no one's being responsive about it. And I was being responsive about it. Now, I think that we have to hold police accountable and at all junctures of all this. There is a unit of public corruption already in the Manhattan DA's office that is actually housed separately from 100 Center Street. And those assistants don't work on any other cases. I'm sitting here as someone who has been protecting people's rights for 12 years. And the police do not act correctly in every situation. But I'm telling you, if there is not some sort of support to the police and some support from communities to actually do their jobs, who's going to become a police officer? You have to balance all of this. You have to balance the fact that, you know what, if you get a crime happens to you and you call 911 and no one shows up, because the police have to go and have to respond to crime. That's what we're doing here. There has to be a balance. You have to hold accountable. I have been witnessing cases for the past 13 years where police have not acted correctly in every case, and police have acted, not in a fair way. I always say, whenever you have obstructing government administration and resisting arrest, that means that the police officer just got annoyed and decided to make an arrest. I think we need to balance this. I'm not saying that all police act correctly and all police need to work within the tenets of the job, but I just think routinely, attacking the police is not going to help us either. There has to be a balance, and that's what I'm saying. And I think if I want to ask the question about shootings going up 200%, I had a very practical answer. That was my answer, and I stand by it. But I think we all have to, go through this and go through, how do we make policing better? How do we make it more responsive to the community? But also, how do we protect and serve the community, which is the mandate of the police? Thanks.
Thank you. Turning now to our next topic, gun violence and violent crimes. Ms. Orleans, we're going to start with you, followed by Ms. Crotty. Ms. Orleans, your opponents in this race have gone on record to discuss their plans to reduce violent crimes and to get guns off the street, from diverting resources to creating a 10-point plan to even creating a specialized gun court and reinstituting an anti-crime unit potentially. What is your plan to address violent crimes, specifically gun crimes?
Well, that's a really important question. And in my opening, I talked about, I think it was my opening or a question you asked me, I talked about my former client, a young woman who was a teenager who was charged with gun possession and who was able to receive a non-incarceratory sentence and who now has not reoffended, has not come back through the doors of 100 Center Street. And that to me is what we should be using as a metric of success. So I do think that, you know, even with issues as serious as gun possession, fire, you know, gun cases, it can't be that we address those solely with punitive prison sentences. But I am very glad you asked, because I have retained a gun safety expert on my campaign, and we will be rolling out a gun policy in the very near future. So everyone, please, you know, go to elizaorleans.com, sign up, you know, we'll be sending updates. But I am committed to using the Manhattan District Attorney's, you know, massive budget and funding proven methods of reducing gun violence, such as deploying violence interrupters, working to end the iron pipeline of guns into New York City. I mean, we do know that the guns that are used here in New York City are typically not from here. These are guns that are coming in from the north, from the south, from other places. And so it's really important that we address those things by you know, using the resources available. But I think, you know, it's also important to kind of talk about the fact that using a carceral approach isn't going, you know, you can't incarcerate your way out of these issues that we're having, especially even including a rise in violent crime, even though I think that that's kind of a misnomer. And when people talk about a rise in violent crime, they're not really looking at the full picture of what the data shows, which is in fact that, like, for example, rapes are down 75%. So when people talk about a rise in violent crime, oftentimes I think it's like these right-wing media organizations or the New York Post who are saying these things in order to fearmonger, in order to prevent people like me, a public defender, from getting elected Manhattan District Attorney, because they want to scare you. They want to say, oh my God, she's not going to want to put people in jail. But the reality is, putting people in jail has not kept us safe. That is not what's working. And that's what we've been doing. And locking up brown and black people, and locking up poor people, and locking up people who are marginalized, like, that's not keeping us safe. And so I think it is time to think about things like using budgets for investing in communities and addressing things and having people go in and figure out ways of doing this that don't just lock people up, that will make the difference here. And I think that, you know, if we're talking about violence perpetrated in our city, we have to talk about the police, because they are perpetrating violence on our communities and they are hurting people. Do you know, I have an iPhone filled with pictures of clients, because at arraignments, I would have a colleague witness their injuries and take photos, and without fail, you know, gashes on their head, bloody, broken, wrists bleeding, you know, coming in all beat up. And who was being violent towards them? Who caused those injuries to them? It was the police. So I think when we're talking about violence, it includes all of these things. And I hate when people try and simplify it and say, well, if you're not going to lock people up, you're not addressing violence, because that's not true. Diverting cases is how we will address these things. We can give people the help that they need, address the underlying issues they're facing, make sure they never come back to the criminal legal system. And that is how we will keep our city safe.
Thank you. Ms. Crotty, a priority in your office will be to prosecute violent crimes and divert your office's scarce resources to victims of violent crimes. New York already has some of the toughest and most restrictive gun laws on the books. Where would you divert resources from, and where would you divert resources to in order to reduce violence? And what resources are we specifically talking about?
I'm not really clear on your question. I mean, I think all of the resources of the Manhattan DA's office most of the resources of the Manhattan DA's office should be going towards violent crime. And how do we make the city safer for everyone? I think that that's what we need to do. I also think that that's part of the process of why white collar crime matters so much, because white collar crime and banks and the dispositions that you get from those funds community treatment programs. The pretrial sentencing, the pretrial program that Mr. Vance set up right now was funded by $250 million from asset forfeiture funds on white collar crime cases. So I think that that's why you need to have someone who knows the balance of how the office works and how to do it. Violent crime is the way what we need to focus on. I mean, and listen, we can all agree that broken windows policing does not work, and it being overly punitive does not work. But under policing has its problems too. We need children to be able to go to school and feel safe. We need stores to keep their inventory in their stores so that they can have thriving businesses in all communities. So having this conversation that's very, albeit one-sided, to how do we do this? It's like we have to look at all of the things that we're doing. And I think that using our resources to violent crime and combat violent crime is one of the most important purposes. At the same time, we have to look at who's doing that. And I think the goal of the Manhattan DA's office has to be, how do we cut recidivism? So I think the big thing is getting to kids from 17 to 25 years old who've made a bad decision, who had a bad day, but isn't a bad person, and really kind of get to them and say, hey, how can we get in here? How can we stop crime from happening? So the matrix of the office has to be done while we are looking at things where it's kind of like, how can we make it so that people don't get back here and we cut recidivism. That is the goal of the district attorney's office, to get in early and to cut kids from keeping to come back. And I think that will radically reduce violent crime if we can get to these kids at the right amount of time in the right way to really cut crime. And that's what it has to be. It used to be, the matrix for the DA. I have this saying where it used to be the tallest building was the best building. That was New York. Now it's what's the carbon footprint? What is it putting out? How do we make a smarter, more efficient, energy efficient city? It used to be with district attorney's office, the longest sentence was the best sentence. We can all agree that that doesn't work anymore. But so the matrix of the DA's office has to change, and it has to change to reduce recidivism. And how do we do that? By getting involved with the younger people who get arrested and saying, how can we stop it? At the same time, we have to know that violent crime needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be the goal of this office is, how do we deal with it to keep all of New York safe?
Thank you. My apologies for the alarm there. Ms. Weinstein, turning to you. You have come out with your own 10-point gun plan to reduce the number of guns on the street. When getting guns off the street is a priority, some of the officers will sometimes circumvent the laws in order to get those guns off the street. I have litigated cases where cops have found guns on people, but their conduct was illegal under the law. As DA, how will you balance the public safety need for getting guns off the street while upholding citizens' constitutional rights under law? And what is public safety?
So many questions, Sean, and I'm glad you asked it that way, because I was sitting and listening to these answers about gun violence and thinking that so often I think that particularly communities who have borne the brunt of violence are presented with a false choice, that either you can have that kind of physical security and you can have law enforcement pursuing these kinds of cases, or you can have your rights. And you have to choose between fair policing or no policing, or you have to choose between fair policing or living without safety. And, I reject all of that. And part of what I tried to communicate in that plan is that we have to bring all of our progress, our innovation, our understanding of different systems to every single problem, including gun violence, right, which is an undeniably devastating problem right now in New York. And we have to both be aggressive in the cases that demand an aggressive response. We have to use diversion programs where we can, like one we had in Brooklyn, for gun possession cases, which has been proven to advance public safety. And we have to support communities that are also working to really put us out of business, right, and stop the violence. To answer your question, I do think that there is no kind of crime that makes it okay for law enforcement, whether it's police officers or prosecutors, to violate the law. And one of the hardest things that I had to do, and that I'm proud of, is in my supervision of the Conviction Review Unit, we even voluntarily asked for convictions to be vacated when, if you asked me, do you think the person whose conviction you just vacated is factually guilty, I would have to say yes, right? Because we have to stand up for the principle that the integrity of the criminal justice system also matters, and everything really follows from that. So, I reject these distinctions, and I really think that we can meet people's needs without ever even putting on the table some of what you're talking about. I do want to say about gun violence. I'm really proud to have the endorsement of Eric Holder, who has modeled the kind of fair, ethical prosecution that I've been talking about today. And I'm equally proud to have the endorsement of Jackie Rowe Adams, who testifies from her own experience losing 2 sons in separate incidents to gun violence. I mean, it's almost unbearable to even say it, that we have to do better. And, I think our job is to meet Jackie's demands.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Court, gun violence is on the rise in New York City. 2020 saw more violent crimes than all of 2019. Your website is devoid of any plan to tackle the rise in crime. What factors can you point to that have contributed to the rise in violence? And if elected, how do you envision your office addressing these factors while still building trust between the police and the community?
It's a great question for all the candidates, and I appreciate it, Sean. Let me tell a story about a friend of mine, Talon Murphy, who many people on this call may know about. Talon is a friend supporting me in this race, and Talon's had to endure the worst in life, to bury a child. He grew up in Grant Houses, West 120th Street, and his daughter was killed by gun violence in Grant Houses. What's significant is what happened after, in certain respects, is that it took Talon 12, 13, 14 months before NYCHA would move his family to a different NYCHA complex, despite the continuing threat of gun violence against his own family. And something Talon said to me that stuck and still sticks about gun violence and its complicated causes and how we root it out is that in communities, in NYCHA complexes like Grant Houses and in West Harlem, often people are faced with a difficult choice. And that choice, as Talon described it to me, was this: fight or flight. That the reasons why people purchase firearms is never to be condoned, and it's wrong. And in most cases, I would prosecute those cases as district attorney. I would allow for diversion practices, but you have to understand the circumstances why young men in NYCHA complexes throughout Manhattan sometimes make that terrible choice and purchase a firearm. I'm not condoning it. In most cases, we will prosecute it. But that example, Talon's example to me of the problems of young people and why they purchase firearms is why I will allow for diversion practices in certain respects, modeled after what District Attorney Gonzalez in Brooklyn has employed. I think that story at least sticks with me and illustrative of the deep-rooted problem of rooting out gun violence and how I would address it as district attorney.
Thank you. Ms. Florence, your website says that you will proactively target sources of gun violence and work collaboratively with other organizations to stop it. What are the sources of gun violence and how will you stop it?
When we talk about gun violence, we need to think about the shootings that have happened and the shootings that haven't happened yet. So my plan is involving targeting the guns before they get to New York. Right? It starts with looking at the traffickers. And while I hear lots of policies, I am the only one in this race who has actively prosecuted gun traffickers. I have gotten dozens of guns off the street. And how did I do that? It wasn't a one-off case. It was long-term investigations. It was partnering with multiple agencies. I have a history in my career. I have an incredibly long career of going after power. And the way we do that with gun trafficking is we need to look at the sources, and we know that they come from North Carolina and Virginia for the most part. So the first thing that we do is we make those partnerships with those cities and those states, and we target the guns before they get to New York. When it comes to then the shootings that have happened, right, we need to look at, again, the source of why they happened. We have to ask the whys. For too often, it's just been an assembly line where we just process cases as they go. But when we look at the whys, we do see that it relates directly back to systems that have been failing our kids and our communities, whether it's housing, schools, defunded after school programs. What we need to be doing is starting not when they're 17. Think about when kids really start to move in a different direction. It's around the end of elementary school, it's middle school. And we need to target those kids and give them alternatives early. And what that means, I have a plan for funding programs that will get those kids out of that cycle. It starts with giving them a coding class and giving them a goal. When we connect with those kids and they finish those coding classes, we are going to connect with all of the other other agencies in New York City, which each of them, for example, have an IT program. Every department in New York City has an IT department. And we can do internships for those kids, targeting kids who live in NYCHA, ACS involved, and homeless shelters, to give them alternatives for them to see that they have a path that will ultimately lead to a middle-class job. Kids who have hope for the future do not choose guns. And that is my plan for proactively getting rid of gun violence before it ever happens and stopping the guns at the border.
Thank you. Ms. Lang, your approach to gun violence is to create a specialized gun court to handle all cases of gun crimes and possession. New York City has some very strict gun laws. How would a specialized gun court reduce gun violence?
John, the specialized gun court is one piece of a multi-pronged plan. And the multi-pronged plan has to take into account what some folks don't know, which is that in New York State, the statutory minimum is 3.5 years for first-time possession of a loaded gun. And once that case is indicted, the only permissible offer is 2 years in state prison. So by the time a case is indicted, it is often too late for a case to be diverted and someone to be provided with resources. So really, this has to be assessed before the indictment stage. And one way to do that is by doing a holistic assessment in the courts, bringing in clinicians and working collaboratively with defense counsel and trauma-informed experts to assess what's at the core of someone making the decision to pick up the gun, and pairing someone with resources, and not putting the office in a position where their hands are tied by these draconian mandatory minimums that the legislature has saddled us with, and which we know haven't only not worked, but have actually locked up countless Black and brown young men in particular from New York City. So creating a specialized gun court is one piece, but it really also, we have to commit to building wraparound services for young people who are brought in possession of guns, supporting community-based intervention programs. We are a resource-rich city that has so many smart, thoughtful, community-based resources led by community leaders that we can pair people with if we haven't already indicted them and have them facing a mandatory minimum. But we have to ensure adequate funding to local grassroots anti-violence organizations and incentivize responsive sentencing. So that means building a workforce that is mission aligned and that is committed to using the levers of the district attorney's office to address mass incarceration, including with respect to cases where people are charged with possessing guns or with using guns. I'm the only candidate in the race who has responded time and again to scenes of street gun violence, including murders, who has met weeping families in the hospital at their most vulnerable moments. And I bring that to the vision that I've created alongside community partners, including people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system for using guns, to take into account all of the reasons why people pick up guns, why people carry guns, and why we know that what we have been doing simply isn't working. But that doesn't mean that we can just wash our hands of it, that we have to invest deeply in community-based resources in order to stem the tide of gun violence, which is at the highest it's been in 14 years. And we have to do that without rolling back the progressive efforts that so many people are calling for. And in fact, by scaling them and bringing to bear the expertise of clinicians and others.
Thank you. Sorry again about the alarm. Keeping track of time here. And the final question for this topic goes to Mr. Bragg. Mr. Bragg, two of your priorities as soon as you enter office would be to tackle drug and gun trafficking to ensure public safety. But drug and gun trafficking alone do not account for the recent spike in violent crimes. Question to you is, what does public safety actually mean to you? And how will focusing on gun and drug trafficking reduce the number of violent crimes?
Thanks, Sean. Let me start by saying I've heard a lot of talk about these kids and these communities. I'm that kid. I'm raising two of those kids. Those kids are my Sunday school students. They're my Harlem Little League kids. And I know this violence firsthand through my own experience and through them. So I've had a shootout on my block. I've had a semi-automatic weapon put to my head. I've had a homicide victim die on my doorstep. This is not academic. This is not these kids. This is not these communities. This is us. So I wanted to start with that because this is deeply personal to me. I've looked into the eyes of a loved one after his best friend was shot in front of him. I know what that's like. So this is a top priority issue. And I've spent a lot of my career working on it, Sean. My view is that if we stop the flow of guns coming in, that will stop a lot of other crimes. And it's just not my view from my personal experiences. Unlike what one of the other candidates says, I've actually worked on this. The cases that are based upon guns flowing in, it's based on a data portal that my team at the Attorney General's office built, right? And another candidate talked about not going out to crime scenes. I've been to crime scenes with homicide victims and consoled families. So I've lived it personally, and I've also lived it professionally. And I know from my own work that if we do the source, if we follow where the contraband is, if it's guns or drugs or the money that finances it, that we will stop the violence on our street. So I mentioned in my opening a case I did as a federal prosecutor, prosecuting the head of a $30 million business who was financing significant drug trafficking, millions of dollars flowing through. We looked at that case and we saw when we cut off the flow of money, that reduced violence. So Sean, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at the money, following where the money is, turning it off, going to where the source of the guns are and turning it off. And I know from the cases I've done, the effect that will have on our neighborhoods, and particularly in Upper Manhattan, where I've lived for my entire life. So yeah, I realize that there are other issues, but I think if we go to the source, we'll also avoid some of this looking just at the end, snatching up young Black and brown kids off the street. We'll avoid that because we'll stop the crime before it happens. And I just wanted to sort of end with a few things we're going to put into the chat log. I've written an op-ed laying out my gun flow strategy, which also talks about employing and using our community interrupters, like I used to say coup and intervening before things happen. We're also going to put in the gun portal, which I designed, which apparently other prosecutors on this call have used to good use. So I thank them for that. And lastly, going back to your last question about testifying, I failed to mention that I was the only candidate this week to testify before the CCRB, which is seeking authority to have jurisdiction over lying in these investigations. I think that's a critical issue, and we're going to try to put our testimony from this week in the chat log. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. Now turning to our final topic, prosecutorial policies and values. We're going to start with Ms. Weinstein, followed by Mr. Bragg. Ms. Weinstein, you told the Jewish Insider back in July of last year that calls to defund the police are misguided. You said, quote, "I don't like the word defund. I think it's inflammatory and actually not particularly solution oriented." End quote. Surely you understand why the calls to defund the police were made. As DA, you will decide what cases are brought forward and what cases are not prosecuted. If elected, how do you propose using the DA's office to restore trust between the police officers and the communities they police?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for the question. And I very much embrace the calls for racial justice that I think often underlie the call for defunding the police. And I understand where it's coming from, and I think that we all have to engage in this fight. I don't think that if defunding just means what it does on its face, which is to just reduce law enforcement and make law enforcement smaller, I don't think that that's particularly productive. And that's what I was trying to say. And I'd love to expand on that here. I think that that actually kind of goes back to the false choice that either you can have policing that isn't fair to you, that doesn't respect you, and that isn't actually protecting you and standing with you, or you can have no policing at all. And I much prefer to talk about reforming and reimagining policing as I do prosecution. And I actually think that some of the work that we have done in local prosecutors' offices on reform have touch points that are consistent with, I think, the beginnings of police reform. First of all, we do have to pull back from cases that don't advance public safety and to shrink. And in DA Gonzalez's first term, which is not even over, he has reduced the number of cases that office prosecutes from about 80,000 to 60,000 cases a year without any cost to public safety. And likewise, that kind of shrinkage, I think, makes sense. I think we need a different cadre of first responders to go out to situations that don't call for law enforcement. I also think that an important part of this kind of reform is bringing in people with different competencies. Just as we did in Brooklyn, we had social workers running the gun diversion program that I've referred to, people who could help us to talk to survivors of these kinds of crimes. I think that is consistent with some of the calls for police reform that makes sense to me. And then ultimately, look, you asked about trust. All of us in law enforcement have to recommit to putting our focus on the cases that demand force and law, and putting our resources into protecting vulnerable communities. And I think that if we don't do that, if we aren't spending our time doing the very thing that we are called to do, then communities, our neighbors, people are right not to trust us. And so I think it's in doing that work, and we can measure that. Do people want to participate in law enforcement, to serve as witnesses? Do they want to come forward and report? We haven't talked much about gender today. I think it's just devastating that only about half of cases of domestic violence and sexual assault are even reported. That's an indication of a real broken trust between people in law enforcement. We just think, like, why would I even come forward after this terrible thing happened to me? So we do have our work cut out for us ourselves, prosecutors, just as the police do. And I think that there are some strategies that we've begun to do the work on that can help us get there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Bragg, you've gone on record that if elected, you promised that the decisions of your office would be survivor-focused and trauma-informed. Many of those incarcerated have experienced a great deal of trauma in their lives, which oftentimes plays a role in the crimes they commit. If elected, how will survivor-focused and trauma-inform your decisions when prosecuting cases? And will trauma only pertain to victims, or will trauma factor into defendants as well, given that they suffered some form of it in their lives?
Thanks, Sean. The whole system is filled with trauma. So the way you frame your question is really apt. We have, and some may have heard the expression, hurt people hurt people. It's one that we use in my church. We have a system where someone may be a witness on Monday, they may be a victim on Wednesday, and they may be charged with a crime on Friday. I know that, I've lived that, that's happened to my friends. And so I want to view harm holistically and focus on that through a system that really encourages people to come forward. Particularly, we have an underreporting issue on sex crimes, and particularly in rape and sexual assault, and making sure that we're not going to be ends oriented, where you quote win the case, but focusing on the trauma of all those involved. And one cornerstone that I would use would be restorative justice process. Manhattan DA Cy Vance has completely undervalued this. New York Law School, where I know you're an alum, we were a leader in this issue. We had a topic conference on restorative justice just last year. And we can scale up so that we are sitting around and talking about what is the driver of the violent crime, and talk about it and solve these issues as communities. I would facilitate that process. That can happen outside of the judicial context or sometimes within it. But that would be a real priority for me, because I know from the cases I've done, kind of standing side by side with survivors in sexual assault cases and other kinds of violent cases, I know that the trauma is not just them. It affects their neighbors, their communities, their family. And I know the people who do the harm have previously been harmed before. So that would be a real focus, and we would scale up the restorative justice process. And we'd also have, as I had at the Attorney General's office, people on staff who are skilled in this, doctors, social workers who can help us. And we'd also partner with the great community-based organizations that I've learned from, I've been serviced by my whole life, because some things should be handled best outside of the criminal justice system. So we would prioritize community-based organizations, restorative justice process, and really going where the harm takes us, right? Because we know when we have people go and get incarcerated, that incarceration experience itself, the data show, can lead to more violence. So we're going to have that as a cornerstone, and it's going to be something that's going to report directly to me when we think about restorative justice and scaling that up. I'm going to personally oversee that and bring to bear, entire lifetime of professional and personal experiences to making that be something that addresses all the harm in Manhattan.
Thank you. Ms. Florence, on your website, it says the DA's office needs to redefine success, walking away from the convictions and the number of cases as a benchmark of success, and instead moving towards implementing restorative justice alternatives and reducing mass incarceration and recidivism. The question to you is, what is restorative justice to you, and what restorative justice alternatives would you implement if elected?
It really bears mentioning that in order to understand how to change the system, you have to have worked in it. And my record is 25 years long of actually practicing what is on my website. And I'll give you an example, Sean. When I was prosecuting a major insurance fraud ring, there was an Uber driver. And that Uber driver ended up being involved in the ring and committing a major insurance fraud. And I had a choice. The office, the way I would have been measured, I could have gotten a top level conviction for insurance fraud. But I asked his lawyer, it didn't seem right to me what I knew, little I knew about him. And I asked his lawyer to come in, and they came in together. And what I learned was this particular man had the world on his shoulders. He had a heart condition, he had financial problems. And ultimately, at the end of the day, while I could have sought a big old jail sentence and a felony conviction, I knew that would not make anyone safer, and it would not be justice. So in that case, we worked together to make sure that he did not have a felony conviction and that he paid back whatever funds he got out of the insurance fraud, not immediately with the threat of incarceration hanging over his head, but seeing his humanity and understanding as a person that we all face challenges and sometimes make the wrong decisions. And we don't have to use the criminal justice system as an overly punitive, cold, and dark place. It can be a place of opportunity and not obstacle. That particular case, which is one of many throughout my career, I have never over-relied on incarceration. I've always looked at both sides of the case, both survivors, because that has been very important. I spent 5 years working in domestic violence, not alongside, not standing side by side, but working with the victims to bring justice, to do the cases no matter what that meant. So what I want to be clear about is when I say restorative justice, yes, I am all for the practices that Daniel Sered has really pioneered here in New York, and particularly I know in Brooklyn, and I'm all for bringing those to the Manhattan DA, but it's much bigger than that. It means literally looking at everyone's humanity, both our own humanity as prosecutors, understanding we are fallible, and the people that are both our victims and our defendants.
Thank you. Ms. Crotty, you told New York County Politics newspaper just a month ago that there needs to be healing between police and communities, and that it starts with intelligent reform. You said first, we need to enhance the training of our police force. Second, significantly increase police community interaction through neighborhood and leisure events, regular classroom visits, and open houses at precincts and community centers. While these ideas are great, the NYPD may not enact these changes. If elected DA, what will be your office's philosophy to help bridge the gap that divides the community and the police officers?
I mean, I think in this world we have it starts with conversation and it starts with practice. I think we've had a lot of conversations over the past year that have changed the arc of where we're going. And I think they're all for the good. And those conversations do not happen until we bring up the topics. I think you cannot change the police if you don't look at what is going on. I think you have to raise the age of police officers. I think you should look at hiring police officers from New York City. I think that training right now for police officers is 6 months. It should be closer to 2 years with them getting some sort of associate's degree at the end of it. And then after 2 years of training and a somewhat of a college degree, we pay them better. And then we have a more robust police force, more educated police force in what the job is and how to better do it. And I think that those are the things that we have to think about, because they have a job with a lot of responsibility, and they are the first lines of all of this. And if they are not trained correctly, and if they are not doing their job correctly, it impedes how the prosecutor's office does their job. And so I think that it all starts with police. Unfortunately, I'm running for Manhattan District Attorney, not for mayor. So I would encourage everyone listening to this to really look at all of the mayor's policies on what their policing is, because it really matters. Because the mayor is the one who hires the police commissioner, and the mayor is the one who sets the tone. I think de Blasio today set out a good thing where he set out some of his reforms for the police, and it's all about accountability. If police act incorrectly, they get fired. If someone dies, they get fired. If there is a allegation of abuse, that gets investigated. If it's founded, it gets fired. There's no assumption of keeping your job as a police officer. And that's per the de Blasio initiative that he announced today. And I think that that's something we have to continue carrying on. I think that that's where we really kind of get to a difference. And so I think, that's where policing starts, and that's where policing should start. And I think that would make us all safer. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Lang, you told Worth magazine 10 days ago that you are the candidate who's best equipped to implement the overdue transformations that the criminal justice in Manhattan needs. You work for the Manhattan's DA's office, an office that has contributed to mass incarceration for decades. My question to you is, what are the most pressing transformations that are needed? And why are you better equipped to implement these transformations than the other candidates, especially one that's a public defender?
Amongst the many plans that I have laid out on my website, I have included a number that are focused specifically on this issue. And I know how to transform the office because I have worked, albeit slowly, during my time there, because institutional change is hard. And as a leader there, I will be in a position to make that change quickly, to implement it effectively. That includes starting by building a mission-aligned, inclusive workforce that recruits and retains diverse lawyers and other staff who reflect both the diversity of our city and the values that the city is calling for. Then it includes a plan for mission-aligned metrics, building out a set of comprehensive performance evaluation standards so that lawyers and others know that they will be rewarded for the kind of behavior that we want to see amongst assistant district attorneys, rather than the number of cases they process or the number of cases, the number of years that any given case gets in prison afterwards. It will incentivize the use of restorative justice. It'll incentivize availing themselves of the breadth of community-based resources that New York City has to offer. It also includes then building out a legal training plan that is not just teaching the basics of lawyering, which is critically important, but that includes teaching from other fields, neuroscience, behavioral science, that helps inform the culture of the office and moves towards a culture that treats everyone with dignity. I've also laid out a plan for advocating for prosecutor and defense disparity, because the disparities between funding attorney's office and the city's indigent defense agencies is part of the problem. And district attorneys have an obligation to advocate for that being changed. I also have a plan for a full-scale conviction integrity unit that is not just backward looking, but that does a an analysis of any cases where there are a wrongful conviction to determine how we can avoid those sorts of things happening in the future. And I have created a position of a prosecutorial ombudsman that would be an independent person who is publicly known, who can investigate any allegations from anywhere, from people who are charged with crimes, from crime victims, from the defense bar, internally in the district attorney's office, or from other agencies. And that person can conduct a full investigation into allegations, and then can, without approval from the district attorney or senior staff, take it to the state ethics committee, or can advise that someone receives sanctions or dismissal. I know how to change the office because I have worked to reform it from the inside and the outside, and I have a large scale plan to be able to do that. I'm committed to a district attorney's office that is focused on ending mass incarceration, and the only way to do that is through the plans that I have laid out that demonstrate a deep knowledge of how the office works and how to make it change.
Thank you. Mr. Court, you told Street Blog magazine last month that, quote, in the vast majority of cases, a driver hits and kills a pedestrian or cyclist, and the collision is called an accident, and the driver faces few or no consequences, end quote. This implies that in a vast majority of cases, the driver is intentionally hurting people. Your words disregard the person's mens rea, or for other people, mental state at the time of the incident. The question to you is twofold. First, do you believe that drivers are intentionally hurting people in a vast majority of these cases? And two, will your office philosophy be to not require proof of a criminal intent, in this case, mens rea, by a driver before assigning a criminal penalty?
My plan as prosecutor and as district attorney will be to follow through on the legislation that I'm working on right now in Albany to change the standard from reckless to aggressive driving. And that's what I want to do. And that's the philosophy I'll take, to hold people accountable, drivers accountable who engage in aggressive driving, not simply the much, much higher standard of reckless driving, which is the problem. Look, I know of this problem personally as a legislator. I represent a district in Midtown with both tunnels and Midtown traffic. I've heard and met many of survivors of vehicular violence. I take this very personally. As someone had to deal with traffic issues, vehicular violence issues for 10 years in the legislature, being from the district that I do in Midtown. So I understand this, and I've talked to the survivors. It's not about jail time. It's not about incarceration. What it is twofold. It's about a city administrative process that's an abject failure and holds nobody accountable with barely any adjudicative function. And that's the reason why I will be a prosecutor in this regard, to hold people accountable, because there's no functioning city administrative process. And I can't rely on the next mayor to fix that. I'll fix that as district attorney, not for the purposes of incarceration in most cases, but for the purposes of accountability and driver re-education programs, which have been implemented slowly in Manhattan. I would expand that and use some of the forfeiture fund money to expand the number of programs that deal with driver education. But I will, in many cases, use my tools as a prosecutor to hold drivers accountable, likely for the suspension of someone's license.
Thank you. And the last question on this topic, Ms. Orleans. You told Under the Radar magazine on Wednesday, in response to their question, what is the biggest thing New York can do to help the communities from a social and criminal justice perspective? You responded by saying that people can elect people who care and who want to make changes, and who want to make sure that investments in the communities are made. If elected, what is the biggest thing that you can do as DA to help the communities from a social and criminal justice perspective?
It's a great question, and it's so important. And as the only candidate who has spent my entire career going up against the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in the courtroom, I have seen the devastating effects of the way in which that office operates, of the prosecutorial misconduct, the mismanagement, and the way it destroys people's lives. And so as the only public defender in this race, I will come into this job with a clear understanding of the stakes that are at, that are people's lives. And so I think when it comes to these things, we really need to make sure that we are providing investments in communities, but that we're also doing as much as we can to make it so that the district attorney's office doesn't have control of all of these things. I mean, it is an arm of law enforcement, and it is something that devastates people's lives. And so, it's my commitment to shrinking, everyone says shrinking the footprint of the DA's office. Yes, but what does that mean? That means prosecuting fewer cases. That means just declining to prosecute certain categories of cases. Because as a public defender, I understand how the prosecution of those cases is used against thousands of people that I've represented. The last thing we need is another career prosecutor running the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Prosecutors are and always have been complicit in propping up and perpetuating the system of mass incarceration that has caused so much pain and trauma and irreparable harm. So we need to stop electing career prosecutors to be DAs and start holding them accountable for these terrible wrongs. When I'm Manhattan District Attorney, I will fight for the people I've always fought for. And those are the people of the city of Manhattan, of the city of New York, of the state of New York. The prosecutors stand up every day and say, on behalf of the people of the state of New York. And so they're acting in your name with your tax dollars, and they are locking people up. And we need someone who has truly a dedication, who wants to make these changes, not just say the right words, not just learn to say, now that it's popular, we need to reimagine policing, we need to end mass incarceration. No, someone who's truly fought for their entire career to do so. That's who we need as our next Manhattan District Attorney, and I will be the person there fighting for all of you.
Thank you very much, everyone. That completes our 4 topics. We do have a few minutes here, so I hope you all will humor me a bit. I'm going to ask one final question to all the candidates, and I'll reveal the order in just a minute. My question is very simply and straightforward. To you, what is justice? I'm going to start with Ms. Florence, followed by Mr. Court, Mr. Bragg, Ms. Lang, Ms. Weinstein, Ms. Crotty, and then Ms. Orleans. Ms. Florence, what is justice?
Justice is using the power of the prosecutor to fight for all people and not advantage one group, which has happened over the last decade under Cy Vance. Justice is making sure that when we use our power, that we go after crimes of power, meaning that we prioritize domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, labor crimes, and housing. We haven't talked much about housing crimes, but to me, when I say safe at home, safe at work, and safe on the street, I mean we need to be prioritizing not only what we used to think, burglaries and robberies and things like that. We need to look at the powerful that have been getting away with it. I have done that. Landlords and employers who injure immigrants, workers, and tenants. That is justice. When you hold those groups accountable, who have gotten a pass, who have lived in housing court for all this time and other places, that's when we will have true justice, when everyone feels comfortable coming to the DA's office and knowing that they will be taken seriously, whether you are a woman, an immigrant, or a person of color.
Thank you. Mr. Court, what is justice?
Justice is fighting for those who have never received it and never believe that they will. The distinguishing factor between myself and many of the other good lawyers in this race is my record in Albany and the courtroom in fighting for justice. You look at the fights that I've taken over the last 10 years, fighting to decriminalize something called gravity knives. Because of my work, 3,800 people will never see the inside of a precinct or be prosecuted. Or it's my fight on bail reform as the leading voice against the rollbacks and for why we need a just system that disconnects one's wealth or lack thereof from their liberty. I have taken up and fought for these fights for 10 years in the legislature while also having practical experience in the courtroom. And why does that matter? Because I have defended these votes. I have fought for these things and had to answer before actual voters in getting elected and reelected with it. And from a district that is 87% white, I have taken up the fight for justice for people who don't look like the majority of my constituents. That's the type of district attorney I'll be, and that's how I define justice, Sean.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg, what is justice?
So justice, I would say, is 5 things. The first thing is community partnerships. So my lifelong work with faith groups, being a Sunday school teacher, a Harlem Little League coach, partnering truly with community. We've got a DA's office in Washington Heights that sits empty and one on 125th Street that is not in partnership with the community. Justice, secondly, is fairness and civil rights. It means holding police accountable, like I'm doing in my case representing the Garner family, or like I did in my prosecution of the FBI agent who lied. Justice, thirdly, is inclusion. It means an office that looks like all of us. I purposely and consciously did not go to the DA's office coming out of school because it did not include me. It did not include or speak to neighborhoods I'd come from and experiences I've had. I want to change that. I want an office that has racial diversity, that has gender diversity, that includes survivors and includes people who have reentered. Fourth, justice is one standard of justice for all, not Harvey Weinstein evading accountability, not Jeffrey Epstein evading accountability, but the kind of cases I've done throughout my career, holding Trump accountable for the Trump Foundation, holding Harvey Weinstein accountable in my lawsuit against him at the AG's office, prosecuting Malcolm Smith, who was the Senate Majority Leader, for bribery. And finally, justice is about standing up for the marginalized, all of us who've been pushed to the side. And that's the work I've done prosecuting landlords who've harassed tenants out of their homes, and prosecuting workers across a whole broad range of industries who've been cheated out of their wages. Those are the 5 key ingredients of justice, Sean. They're what I've dedicated my work to, and they are my life. They are my life's work. Thank you for the opportunity to be in dialogue today.
Thank you. Ms. Lang, what is justice to you?
Justice is the name of a toddler of my friend Victoria Davis, whose brother Delron Small was shot and killed by NYPD. Justice is also the name of a toddler child of a friend of mine who received his college education at Otisville Correctional Facility and is now working full-time at Columbia Law School. Justice is the next generation. What we need is a criminal justice system that sees everyone it touches as all of our children. People who come through the system as victims, who have been traumatized by sexual violence, by gun violence, by exploitative landlords. Justice is a system that sees our children and people who come through the system because they have committed a horrible crime, but still need to be treated as a human being. Justice is a system that sees that even people who witness crimes experience tremendous trauma, and that we owe it to them to build a system that incorporates their voices. My district attorney's office will be in our communities. There will be advisory boards comprised of directly impacted community members, of faith leaders, in partnership with community-based organizations. My district attorney's office will be framed around the core principle of human dignity that I have seen class after class in my work teaching in New York State's overcrowded prisons that are a hotbed for coronavirus as we speak. West Harlem Progressive Democrats, all of our children are justice. Join me in ensuring that the district attorney's office is one that sees that prioritizes prevention and healing, that emphasizes racial and gender equity, and that is committed to the dignity of every New Yorker. Find more about my plans at votelucylang.com. Follow me on social media at LucyLangNYC. Reach out anytime at 917-633-7067. I look forward to working in partnership with all of you and would be honored to receive your endorsement and work together towards justice for all our children.
Thank you. Ms. Weinstein, what is justice to you?
Thank you, Sean. Justice is where I started this conversation today. To me, justice is a world in which everybody experiences fairness and feels safe inside her home, outside her home, in the street, because that's how we level the playing field. That's how, without experiencing fairness and safety, people can't thrive. They can't seize opportunities. They can't move forward and have a better life, right? And then the question becomes, how do we, in this office, how do we do justice? And I think that that's a number of things. Some of them superficially intentioned, so we have to work hard to reconcile them. First, as Judge Garland said last week when he was nominated to be Attorney General, justice is like cases being treated alike. So no matter who you are, what uniform you wear, what office you occupy, if you do the same thing as somebody else, you're held to account in the same way. Justice is also, and this is the tension and why you need sophistication and experience to put it together, it means meeting every single case on its own terms and figuring out, what do our values demand of us in responding to this situation? It means exercising our humanity in every single case and making sure that we are tailored in our responses. And finally, I think that justice means looking out for the most vulnerable among us, whether that is a non-citizen who's afraid to come forward and report to the criminal justice system, whether it's somebody living on a block with gun violence who's sick and tired of it and needs that to change, whether it's a woman who's experiencing violence in her own home. And to me, justice means saying, just like every case needs to be treated alike, that no matter who you are, those harms against you, we take equally seriously, and we do our very best with the power and the resources that we have to fight for you.
Thank you. Ms. Crotty, what is justice to you?
Justice is what I've been doing for the last 20 years and for the last 13 years as a defense attorney. Going into court every day and representing people, individual citizens here in New York against the district attorney's office, against the U.S. attorney's office, against various other agencies. I fight for justice every day. I fight for the right thing. I think justice looks like listening to people, listen and understanding context and understanding facts and circumstances. That's how you get justice. Injustice is not listening to people. Injustice is deciding what one person thinks it's right for everyone. That's what injustice is. So justice is really listening and doing the right thing. We cannot have a district attorney's office that does not do the right thing. And that is in each and every individual case, based on each and every individual set of facts, and looking at each and every community those people come from. Anybody who gets arrested anywhere in New York, that's what I'm talking about. So looking at all those factors is how we get justice. If we do not look at all these factors, if we do not listen to all these factors, and if we do not understand where people are coming from, we will never have justice. And that's what we need, is justice and listening and learning and doing the right thing.
Thank you. And finally, but certainly not least, Ms. Orleans, what is justice?
So for me, justice requires people being free to exist in their communities and have their needs met, and building communities that prosper and creating environments where families and businesses don't have to live in fear of being harmed or having their property taken. And I think safety is essential in that. But I think justice is something that is deeper than that. And I want to tell a quick story about a young man I represented, who I'll call James for this, protect his privacy. And I represented him for nearly 2 years, and he is a young man who should have his whole life ahead of him. He loved to read. He always had a book with him when he came to court. And he was suffering from a pretty serious substance use disorder and a number of other medical issues that made him very vulnerable. And despite our pleas for mercy, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office decided to send James to prison. And I remember on the day of his sentencing, James looked at the assistant district attorney in the courtroom and said, "Please, please, can't I have a chance?" Well, I found out early on during the pandemic, where the rates of infection at Rikers were more than 10 times that of New York City, that James had not been transferred upstate. And he was sitting at Rikers Island in the Northern Infirmary Command. And as we know, at NIC is where they send the sickest people. So he was basically sitting there waiting to die because of a substance use disorder. And he did contract COVID. Thankfully, he has come through it and is okay. But he was just a number in in terms of Cy Vance's office and the Manhattan District Attorney's office, a prosecutor would have thrown his life away because they simply don't think about justice on a day-to-day basis. But as someone who's spent my career fighting for human beings and seeing the way in which they're treated by our unjust, cruel criminal legal system, justice means thinking about people and putting people first, always. And so that's what I would say in terms of, justice. I think we could write dissertations on this, but really thinking about people and thinking about human beings and thinking about their lives and thinking about the underlying circumstances and stories behind each and every one of them is what justice is, and making sure everyone is safe.
Thank you. Thank you all. That completes our topics for this afternoon. We will now turn to closing remarks. I've provided you all with the order. We will go in reverse order from the first topic. Thus, Mr. Court, the floor is yours for the closing. You have 2 minutes.
I thank you, Sean, and I will try and be brief as the hour is long. And to thank you to my colleagues and competitors in the race. Someday we'll all be in the same room, but until now we're all virtually together. So thank you for the lively debate as well. To me, as someone who's been on the ballot times in the last 15 years, campaigns, they're not simply the battle of the resumes or anyone's own individual experience. They're about ideas, and they're about who's really going to change this office. One of the first forums that all of us were ever at, the question was posed to many of us who were in the race at that time. When the inevitable rise in crime happens or some bad incident occurs with someone who may have been released, will you stick with it? Will you continue on your reform agenda? Or will you not? Will you step back? Will you do the political easy thing? And that's what I think distinguishes me from the other good lawyers in this race. I talked about my experience. I talked about the things I fought for. I haven't won all of them. I've lost some fights in Albany. I've lost some cases in the courtroom, but I never stopped fighting for what I believe in. I never stopped pushing the issues I believe will make a change, not necessarily to my constituents who always fare a better result than the constituents 10, 15, 20 blocks to the north of me, but communities that don't look like the one I serve. That's why I'm running for district attorney. And that's why you can trust me that if you vote for me, if you support me, I will follow through on my vision for reforming this office. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Orleans.
I appreciate you, Sean. Thanks for putting in so much time and effort on these questions. And thanks to everyone for being here today. And I've appreciated hearing from, everyone in this race today, but I think this makes the contrast even clearer that the last thing you need is another career prosecutor running the Manhattan District Attorney's office. And for far too long, prosecutors have valued convictions over justice, as we were all just talking about, and undermined the integrity of that office. And I think it is our obligation as people who identify as progressives to think about what it would mean to stand with someone who has spent their career as a prosecutor. We have to remember that lives are at stake, and that no matter what words are coming out of people's mouths or what talking points they've gotten down pat, that the important thing is the authentic commitment to fight back against this system that is inhumane, that is cruel, that is unjust, and that does not keep us safe. We can't keep doing more of the same and expect real change. It is our obligation as progressives to get someone into that office who will bring real change, and who best to do that but the person who has been fighting against that office for her entire career. I am that person. I have that will and commitment, and I know that New York City is ready for it. And I know that all of the progressives are going to get behind me and be ready to bring about real change. And I know that because I'm running the most grassroots campaign of anyone in this race. I have thousands and thousands of supporters already, and I'm so excited to work with all of you to really make sure that this change takes place. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Mr. Bragg.
Thanks, Sean, for all of the deeply informed questions informed by your professional experience, no doubt. I am the candidate in this race who has the deepest professional experience doing the kind of cases that will actually make us safe, but who also hasn't done the kind of cases that have been the drivers of mass incarceration brought out of the Manhattan DA's office. I'm also the candidate in this race who's done the most civil rights work in the courtroom of every candidate. It's that combination So whether it's been doing serious gun trafficking work, stopping the flow of guns coming to our streets, whether it's been doing cases involving heinous sex crimes, I've done things that actually keep us safer. And in terms of civil rights, I've been fighting for police accountability since I was 15, filing a complaint with the Civil Complaint Review Board, and going on to sue law enforcement and prosecute law enforcement. No one else here on the screen can say that. And all of these issues, I've lived and I've worked. Take bail. I've made a bail argument as a defense lawyer. I've reformed bail from within the AG's office when I was leading the entire office of 1200. And I've posted bail for a loved one. Violent crime. I've had a gun stuck in my face. I've seen a relative coming off of having his best friend shot. And I've done the kind of cases that keep us safer on guns without criminalizing people for just having a gun. I have a loved one who was prosecuted for being a part of a schoolyard fight for a gun that he never saw or touched. That is unjust. I know it personally. Reentry, one more example. I've led the fight against companies like Party City and Bed Bath & Beyond was at the AG's office, who reflexively discriminate against primarily young Black and brown kids who have a criminal history record. And I know that issue personally too. I'm the only candidate who's had a loved one come home from incarceration and spend a year plus in his house as he looked for housing and employment. So I'm the candidate who has the deepest professional public safety experience and the deepest courtroom civil rights experience. I am the person who should be your next district attorney. Please join with your neighbors, C. Virginia Fields, Charlie Rangel, Senator Robert Jackson, Assemblymember Al Taylor, in supporting one of your fellow neighbors who is the most qualified person to be the next district attorney. I'm at Alvin Bragg NYC on all your social media platforms, and you can reach me at alvin.bragg@gmail.com or 646-232-4221. We put that in the chat. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you. Ms. Lang.
Thank you, Sean. I'm not going to make this about me because it's not about me. It's about all of us. I want to tell you a story about a terrible tragedy on Upper Broadway a couple of years ago. A beloved professor from Lehman College, who was in his 80s, was taking money out of an ATM. And a man who was down on his luck was waiting outside the ATM intending to steal money. The professor came out and pushed the professor down, who hit his head and died of the injuries. The man who pushed him was charged with felony murder, and he was facing a potential life sentence. The assistant district attorney who handled the case had taken the class I created inside Queensboro Correctional Facility and had sat for months alongside incarcerated New Yorkers and had studied restorative justice practices in that classroom. The assistant district attorney remembered restorative justice when the son of the professor came to her and said, "I'm worried about the man who killed my father. I'm worried about what could be happening to him at Rikers Island, and I'm worried about the idea of him doing an unduly long prison sentence, as horribly devastated as I am that my father was killed." And as a result, for the first time in New York City history that I can identify, there was a restorative justice process in a case of murder. And the family of the professor and the man who committed the crime and his sister sat down together after several months of preparation with a clinical expert. And they spent hours together talking about what had happened. The son of the professor was able to talk about the book that his father would now never be able to write, and how heartbroken he was that he would not be able to raise his daughter alongside her grandfather. And the man who committed the crime was able to talk about the desperation that he felt that led him to make that terrible decision that day. They wept together. And at the conclusion, they embraced. I've been lucky enough to stay in great touch with this family and to see that the granddaughter is thriving. And the resolution of that case was far different from any other homicide that I have seen, where everyone who was touched by it came away feeling that they were treated with dignity, And the city is safer for that. And that's the city that I am committed to building alongside you, West Harlem Progressive Democrats, my neighbors, because we have never needed it more than we do now. And it has never been as possible as it is now. So join me.
Thank you. Ms. Weinstein.
Thank you, Sean. You know, in your previous question, you asked us to define justice, and I heard lots of really excellent and heartfelt ideas. But in the end, of course, this election is about who can translate ideas like that into reality. And the best proof that you can do it, of course, is that you actually have done it. And of all of the candidates in this race, I have the deepest well of experience, not just across American legal institutions, from the Supreme Court to the Department of Justice to being a federal prosecutor day in and day out, but of course, in having managed and led an office just like this one, in an office just like this one across the river, as the general counsel and part of the leadership team of the Brooklyn DA's office. And as I review my notes of the things that we talked about today, the things that so deeply affect our daily lives, pretrial detention, reducing that number dramatically, alternatives to incarceration, conviction review, holding the police accountable. I built the Law Enforcement Accountability Bureau in Brooklyn, and we prosecuted police officers and held them to account. Having prosecuted gun crimes and murders myself, having worked to build public trust through things like bringing civil side lawsuits against ICE. You know, I think after this particularly devastating year, it's just been so hard on New York. We just don't have the luxury to elect someone who's just read about these things or thought about them or done adjacent work in similar institutions, or who just feels ready to lead. We need somebody who actually has led on doing the work of making sure that a DA's office can be fair and can deliver on safety for all of us at the same time. And I come to you with all of that experience, and I hope to have your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Crotty.
Thanks so much for having me today. It's been a real pleasure to get to talk about these issues. You know, I always say this, I am the practitioner in this race. I have been in the courtroom for 20 years. I have been there for 6 years as a DA, and for the past 13 years as a defense attorney. I have been representing individuals each and every day. I continue to do my job, even as while I'm running for office. I am stepping up to run for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office because while everyone has lots of policies, no one's really talking about practices. I see the practices day in and day out that affects people in the courtroom. What my perspective and my experience does not come from academia, does not come from a supervisor's office. It does not come from a think tank. It comes from being in the actual courtroom. And how do we make the courtroom fairer for the people who actually go there? I have the right balance. I have the right perspective. I understand what happens in 100 Center Street, and I understand what can make it better. I think I come with it with the experience and perspective to bring about practical reforms while maintaining each and everybody's civil rights. This has been my life work. This is what I've been doing for the past 20 years, and this is what I'm going to keep doing for the next 20 years. I am running for this office because I care what happens in that office. I will be there for the next 20 years, whether I am the next Manhattan District Attorney or not. This is not a stepping stone. This is my career, and I think I can bring fairness to this office. I have delineated my plans on my website. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to your support. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Florence.
Hi, thank you so much. You know, it's been a pleasure to be here this afternoon. You know, I'm running for Manhattan DA to fight for the voiceless. It's what I've done my entire career. And while there are many fine candidates in this race, it's important to look not just at the policies, but what they've done. And when you look at my record, I have always advantaged regular people over powerful. I have stood up to the powerful time and time again. I have prosecuted cases with heart and with my brain. And when I've seen legal loopholes, I have written legislation. I have done the work that a leader does. And I'm stepping up and I'm running for this office because I am the most qualified for it. And I look forward to working with the West Harlem Democrats and all of the communities that have been impacted and that are part of Manhattan. Because ultimately what we have right now is a system where the Manhattan DA has only been in the community when they wanted to be. My approach has always been community-based. The reason I was so successful as the chief of the Construction Fraud Task Force, a task force I created out of thin air. It came out organically out of a case. And when I did the work that I did with the community, the cases reflected that. Record-breaking wage theft cases, manslaughter convictions that were landmark against companies. I have dealt with violent crime, domestic violence, always looking at individuals. That's the way that we want to be using our power as the prosecutor. I know how to do it because I've done it already. And I know what that office needs. I'm not someone who's there to keep things the same way. I will shake it up. And I will do it from the day one because I know what is wrong and I know how to fix it. I would be so honored to have your endorsement and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of the candidates. I want to thank all those who tuned in. I want to thank you, Diana Florence, Dan Court, Alvin Bragg, Lucy Lang, Tali Weinstein, Liz Crotty, and Eliza Orleans for participating in today's forum. It means a lot to have all of you here and to hear from all of you about these important issues that affect our community and obviously our bigger community of New York City as a whole. I want to thank the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club for hosting today. I wish all of you candidates the best of luck and I look forward to, I guess, going against you guys in court. One of you. Just a reminder to everybody that we have an upcoming City Council 9 forum on Tuesday, January 19th at 6:30 p.m. So please tune in for that, as well as an ACS education workshop and status crimes workshop on January 21st at 6:30 p.m. One last thing, we also have a parole town hall educational workshop on January 26th, also at 6:30 p.m. And last reminder, last but certainly not least, please set a calendar reminder for the Manhattan District Attorney's primary election, which will be held on June 22nd. Please get out to vote. Please, please, please pass it along to everybody else. Again, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and thank you to all the candidates. I wish you the best of luck. Be safe out there and take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Sean. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.